Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News.
Our first guest this morning is Dr. Oby Ezekwesili, a very well-known Nigerian. She's also the presidential candidate of the Allied Congress Party of Nigeria, ACPN. She's also known as Madam Due Process, a woman of many parts. She was co-founder of Transparency International, the international body responsible for combating global corruption. She helped in setting up also the Nigerian Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, NETI. She established and served as a pioneer director general of the Bureau of Public Procurement, BPP. Anyhow, the sobriquet, Madam Due Process. She was a two-time minister in the Solid Minerals Development Ministry and the Education Ministry. She was also a vice president of the World Bank and also co-convener of the Bring Back Our Girls movement. And only last week, she was shortlisted for the prestigious Nobel Peace Prize in Sweden. She will be talking to us on why she wants to become Nigeria's next president, what she will bring to the table in the event she becomes president, and her chances in a very crowded field of presidential candidates in the 2019 elections. Oby Ezekwesili, welcome to the morning show.
Good morning, ma'am. It's such an honor to have you here.
Well, I am very delighted to be here. I missed other opportunities of invitation to your show.
We're very grateful
Thank God
to
you
have
made
you
it
here.
at last.
Thank you. All right, so you have such a huge profile, even holding a position as the former vice president of the World Bank, and now you want to go into politics. And, you know, you've gone into politics and even protesting on streets. What gives you the drive to go from such a high position as a former VP of the World Bank to becoming an activist, such as protesting on the streets?
Well, you know, people actually assume that this is a latter-day version of Oby Ezekwesili, but those who know me have known me as an activist and a professional since the maybe the late 80s and early 90s. So I have been an advocate for good governance for almost 3 decades of my life, if not more. That is in the capacity that I was the first woman that led the concerned professionals. And I'm sure that Abati knows about the concerned professionals. We were professionals in remarkable positions of life who decided that the annulment of the 1993 elections was totally unconstitutional. And we organized ourselves to basically advocate against it. And we took on the military, and we never stopped until that mandate disappeared in the way it did when the elected president, Moshood Abiola, died. But one other thing that people don't seem to connect properly is that if I was co-founder of Transparency International in the 80s, in the 90s, then I surely must have been in my advocacy and activism for that long. So when they see an Oby Ezekwesili who advocates for Chibok girls, they assume, oh, you know, she has no job to do. That's why she's doing this. No, it is being part of my life to advocate for good governance.
Activism.
Yes.
We'll go to politics, mainstream politics later. How do you feel about the Bring Back Our Girls campaign in terms of achievement? I mean, it was Chibok girls, then you had Dapchi girls. How do you feel today? Do you think it's been a fruitful exercise, or you feel frustrated?
Well, to the extent that we at least have 107 Chibok girls that have been returned and are in school. Only one of them elected not to continue with her education. The others are in school. That gives us immense joy and sense of impact. For the 112 girls that are still there, we feel so gravely saddened. And we feel like the federal government assumes that by having 107 girls back, it makes up for the rest. Well, there are 112 families that are crying right now, every day. The same thing with the Dapchi girls. You know, when Dapchi girls were abducted, we were furious because we couldn't imagine that another government would leave the same kind of vulnerabilities readily available concerning schoolgirls who were who were left on their own and were captured by, terrorists. So we were furious. We immediately said we were taking the federal government to court. We laid out the program for the advocacy for Dapchi girls. You could see that turned around quickly enough. But our sadness is, how could you negotiate and leave one child behind? Because the federal government or the government did say that 5 other girls had died in the course of the melee following their abduction. But where is Leah Charibu? That makes us very, very sad. And we believe that the federal government hasn't treated the issue with the kind of responsibility that it deserves. Parents of Chibok girls that remain, parents of Leah Charibu, were never remembered. Only in the political season did our president suddenly wake up one morning to call Leah Charibu's mother. We find that very disingenuous. And then you look at the humanitarian aid workers that were captured while serving our own people that are left in almost squalid camps known as IDP camps in Borno State. And nobody makes the kind of effort that you should make concerning your citizens. For us as a movement, our primary issue is that we share humanity. It is on the basis of shared humanity, that sense that there's a social contract between citizens and their government that made us to stand out there to say that the primacy of the human life must not be degraded and devalued in our society.
And if you become president of Nigeria, in terms of security in Nigeria, what are you likely to do differently to prevent the Dapchi situation, to prevent the Chibok situation?
One of the key things that we now know is that we're in a new normal globally. We have to adjust ourselves to figure out how to be safe and secure in the face of terrorism. It could happen at any time. So you program that into your understanding of what it takes to have very effective surveillance over your targets. And one thing that we now know is that the school is a major soft target for terrorists. Yes. So what you then do is the Safe School Initiative has very well constructed programs of how you insulate children from marauders or put them at risk. That's one. Then there is the issue of looking at security beyond the militaristic security system. We have to look at comprehensive security, which therefore means we're talking about human security. When you talk about human security, it's military, but it's also about livelihood security. You're looking at the economics of the breathfulness of communities. When communities feel abandoned and have no stake in governance, they are readily available to unleash on the society. And anyone who can offer them that alternative path of survival would readily get their commitment. So we would look at the broad issues of what's going on really in our rural communities. Okay. We know that the local government authorities have more or less failed. You look at local governments in the country, they should be closest to the people, but we know that that's not the case. And because that's not the case, the citizens at the local level don't feel the presence of government. We need to look at that structure. There's a structural imbalance that has made it difficult for government to be effective in the lives of the people. So when the absence of government is seen, there is a vacuum that is waiting for someone else to fill. And so we would do a lot in terms of neighborhoods and communities and the regeneration of economic activities at those levels. So that takes care of, looking at it broadly. But that's not complete until we can have serious security sector reform. We need a major security sector reform. The reprofessionalization of the military and the police. And looking at the structure, the system of centralized control that we currently have in the country, where nobody acts until they hear from Abuja. Yes. And yet, there are certain activities within communities that don't need anybody from Abuja to be involved. You can tackle them. But where you have monopolized the authority over security and then you are inefficient in responding to situations that threaten the life of your people, their properties, there is something dysfunctional, and that must be fixed. So we would look at that. And then we would look at intelligence assets. You know, one of the things about today's world of disruptive technology is that it offers us humongous opportunity to be innovative in the way that we look at surveillance. And then people now realize that you can actually have regional mechanisms, and that reduces the kind of costs that you have to carry. And we haven't explored quite a lot of alternative pathways to securing ourselves effectively and efficiently. Above all, in all that concerns security, there is almost an opaqueness about security. So the citizens are alienated from the security system. Citizens are part of the security system of their society. We haven't integrated them into that process. We haven't built the kind of relationship with military institutions, the place, so that citizens would have an ecosystem of trustworthy establishments in security that they can work with. And, you know, part of that is because there is a lot of loss of value for money in security spending. That's going to be important to look at. A lot of the times people say, oh, maybe we're not spending enough on security. And I'm saying, can we get value for money for what we are spending on security? Can we even get a measure of transparency in terms of what we're buying each time that we put more budget into security? Because look at what's going on in the Northeast. It is looking like a massive military-industrial complex. You know.
Well, let me ask you about your presidential ambition, because I mean, all of these issues will still come up.
Yeah.
Do you think Nigeria is ready for a female president?
We should have had a female president as soon as we returned to civilian rule, to civilian governance, to democracy in 1999. We should have. By the time we were entering that new millennium, the world was ready for people to simply lead. You know, leadership is gender neutral. You know, I don't understand why people sort of say, are you sure we're ready for a female? What does that mean? That kind of a question is a very, you know, what would I call it? It's an archaic question. I do not expect it from Dr. Abati.
No, because there are some of your critics.
Yes.
They say, I mean, she's today at Bring Back Our Guest movement thing. Tomorrow she's carrying placards and confronting policemen. They say, she's supposed to be somebody's wife. Why can't her husband call her to order?
Oh, we need to take them to school.
No, let her respond to that. No.
Let me actually respond to that. Okay. We need to take all of those people, and I wonder who you've been hanging out with, because that's not the kind of language that is spoken in today's world. People have come to the understanding that women are multifaceted. We multitask. You know, doing the advocacy for Chibok girls, if anyone finds anything even wrong with it, they would have to sit back and reevaluate their understanding of shared humanity. There is no way that the Chibok girls could have been children of my economic class and status, and they would have been abandoned the way they were abandoned. I cannot live in a society where we have different sets of reactions and responses to the poor and to the rich. We know how many times people were abducted who are in the upper crest of society, and how our military and police institutions and intelligence systems worked in order to get them out. These girls were going to be left to their fate. There was no way. As a former Minister of Education who advocated for girl-child education, I would sit and face other matters. So for those who have an issue with my advocacy for Chibok girls, I use it as a basis to think that that's a job for me. They need to reevaluate. They need to think, should my daughter have been one of those girls that were abducted, would I have the same attitude to Oby Ezekwesili as I have? The second thing is when people say carrying placard up and down, they don't understand the office of the citizen. The office of the citizen is the most important office in any democracy. The office of the citizen is the basis for the massive pressure for accountability and good governance. When you look at good governance, when you look at governance as a construct, it is actually, you could look at it as a market. As a market, as a product in a market, if there are suppliers, which in the case of governance, these are the people in government, and then there is a demand side. If the demand side in a market is very dormant and indifferent, what happens is that the supplier begins to behave like a monopolist. That's exactly what has happened to us in the governance of Nigeria. Citizens ignored what the suppliers of governance, those in government, do daily. And because of that, they morphed into monopolist mental mode. And they refused to be accountable and to give transparency and good governance. So, in order to change this, I basically have been very, very forceful in saying that the citizens' side of our democracy must be activated.
You've been involved with Transparency International for more than 2 decades. Now, one of the major targets of this government, the Buhari government, is to fight corruption. What's your assessment of the strategy that this administration has adopted so far?
Oh, I have criticized the strategy because it is a strategy that's not well thought. Every time that we've seen places where effective fight against corruption happened, I normally use the example of places like Hong Kong and Queensland, Australia. Those were, when you talk about systemic corruption, they really had it. And then one day they decided, we're going to do something about this. Maybe in that language of President Buhari, if we don't kill corruption, corruption kills us. So they got tired of corruption. They got tired of the effect it was having in the society. It distorted incentives, just completely made it impossible for those societies to break through to the upper rung of economic prosperity. So they had to tackle it. What they did was three-pronged comprehensive action. So the base of that is that leadership set the tone and led by example and began to talk about reorienting the society toward a climate that is intolerant of corruption. So that's like a values reorientation. They didn't simply sermonize. They actually brought evidence, pieces of evidence that showed the kind of effect that corruption was having on the society. It was having on their GDP, having on their health, their education, and their investment, their capacity to attract investment. People could see evidence that there's something wrong about corruption. We can joke with corruption. So that was important as a base, but it was led through moral, exemplary leadership. And then, on that base, you have the preventive program, and then you have the sanctions. Now, when your comprehensive approach has preventive program to counter corruption, what we normally say in Transparency International is that where the opportunities for corruption are prevalent, you would have higher probability of corruption.
Okay, so what would you do if you become president of Nigeria today to tackle corruption?
So I would do the comprehensive approach.
The comprehensive approach.
I would be an exemplary leader. I would not be the kind of leader that people say, oh, she has integrity, what is the people around her? The leader determines who comes around him or her. I mean, you don't just wake up and you are around.
You're saying indirectly
yes,
that President Buhari is not showing good example, even in the fight against corruption.
Oh, President Buhari has missed the boat completely in terms of being exemplary in the fight against corruption. Look at the many cases of people who were in one form of shady activity or the other, and then you would see almost a willingness to embrace on the part of President Buhari. There are cases where issues emerged. Conflict of interest situations emerge. As a leader of this country, we will finally get a very good definition of conflict of interest, of abuse of public office. I haven't seen it. The sanctions part of it is that you have to make sure that the law, the enforcement institutions like the police, the justice system, including the judiciary, are wired into that state of mind that even if we prevented opportunities for corruption by doing structural changes of economy, deregulating the oil sector, for example, is going to reduce massively the clandestine operations that go on in that sector and reduce opportunities for corruption in that sector. By simply opening up the systems of government in aspects where you need transparency, we can reduce the opportunities for corruption. But there are some diehards. No matter how you reduce the opportunity, they would still indulge. So what we need on the sanction side is that they should know that predictably bad behavior has consequences. It becomes a deterrent.
I'm still trying to figure something out. I mean, you've been Minister of Education, Minister of Solid Minerals, you've been head of the Bureau for Public Procurement, you've been in charge of the Extractive Industry Initiative, you've been Vice President of the World Bank. I mean, why do you want to be president of Nigeria? Because nobody goes in there and comes out clean. Is this about symbolism? Is it about signaling, a feminist gesture, or you really mean business?
I mean business. I am running to win. We are running to win. Anyone who is comfortable with the state of affairs of our country, in how many years now of our democracy, of our return to democracy, recall that we had had many times of democracy and truncation. And the other two times that we effectively had full complement of democracy, they didn't last an average of 5.5 years, right? This is the longest season of democracy, meaning that Nigerians have voted to stay with democracy, despite its imperfections. And yet, what's going on is that the quality of the results from governance seem to go in the reverse compared to other countries. If you are Nigerian and you know that 154 million of our citizens survive on less than $2 a day, that should make you miserable. If you are Nigerian and you read that because of failure of governance, we have 87 million people categorized as people living in extreme poverty. In population, our population is less than 200 million. India, which is a 1,200,000,000 people, is now number 2 to us because we've taken the championship. Terrible, ignoble championship as the world capital for poverty. If that doesn't make you upset, I don't know what would. If the fact that the fragility index that measures the weakness and the strength of countries to be able to be resilient in the face of shocks says that we are the 13th most fragile country, if that doesn't make you upset, I don't know what would.
Let's touch on education here.
13.5 million children are out of school, and we don't feel anything about it.
But let's touch on that real quick. You were the former Minister of Education, and right now, like you just rightly said, there are about 13.5 million children out of school. What would you do differently? What kind of policies would you put in place to prevent this type of thing from
happening? I have a record on that.
Yes,
by the time I was a Minister of Education in this country, the number was about 7.4 million children, and I thought that was terrible. So what we had to do, we thought of a multiplicity of approaches. Remember that basic education is not within the federal mandate list in the Constitution, the exclusive list. When it comes to basic education, that's for the state. But through the Universal Basic Education Commission, we learned how to use incentive signaling to get states where we had the incidence of children out of school to really make it a priority issue. And then we did a number of things where the National Council on Education, which brings the federal government and the state governments together, put this as a top agenda, that we were going to do all kinds of policies, incentivizing parents to get their children into school. And then we began to work with modeling in communities to show that families who sent children to school had better livelihoods. So all of those kinds of measures and policy measures that enabled us, we also did measures that brought more teachers into the classroom system in rural places where there were not enough teachers. Yeah. That was so important. Yes. You know, you needed to have quality teachers in the classroom. We had a special teacher scheme for that. By the time of that particular year, the intakes of that particular year, we reduced the 7.4 million to about 6.8 million. Very little, but it was symbolic of the fact that if you don't navel gaze on a problem and you figured solutions to a problem, you can actually shift the needles. So I am saying that the dismal condition that we find ourselves in the country should worry those of us who have had a fairly decent life. We owe, yes,
on economic management.
Yes, please.
Nigeria's debt profile appears to be rising. I mean, about 73.2 trillion naira, 22-point-something billion dollars. Now, the Minister of Finance, Zainab Ahmed, in her position in the Ministry of Budget and Planning and now as Minister, she says this is inevitable and she says it's under control. She says it is sustainable. What do you think? No,
I don't think they get the meaning of those numbers. You know, I see a lot of them quote the debt to GDP ratio. And they say, oh, we are under-borrowed. Well, if you're not able to service your loan, you're not under-borrowed. You are technically insolvent. You're technically insolvent. What we have now is that the data that should worry our government, which it simply may not be paying attention to, is the debt service to revenue ratio. That's climbing to 70%. In other words, out of every 100 naira that we earn, we must use 69 naira to service the debts that we have carried. And this at a time when you seriously need massive investment into basic public goods of roads, of education and skills, of sustainable development, of focusing, targeting your girls, of looking at rural areas and enabling them to support productivity on the part of smallholder farmers who make up a huge majority of the people in the rural communities of this country. You need massive injection of resources. But what has happened is you don't have the fiscal space to do that. You know, I looked at the 2017 budget performance released by the federal government.
Less than 20%.
No, it was what was terrible? What was terrible was that the entire oil revenue was not enough to pay for the workers in government. We have about 2 million Nigerians who work for government. Our entire oil revenue of a little above 2 trillion naira was not sufficient to pay them.
What do they do with the money?
How
to service debt?
Yes, I'm saying first focus on the fact that Nigeria's main source of revenue is oil.
Which is oil.
And that oil is now no longer sufficient to pay your 2 million workers in government. That is that should give you, that's shocking. Now, what then happens is they complement through the revenue from non-oil sources, right?
Yes.
And after they've done that and then paid for overhead of running government, they then focus on the debt, right? And in order to fully cover the payment for the debt, they have to borrow. Some of what goes into debt servicing today is borrowed money.
How will you address the situation as president?
Right.
Okay, so when you have an imbalance, a fiscal imbalance of this kind, there are many things that you can do, but broadly, you have to look at your revenue side. You need to run the kinds of policies that unlock productivity and unleash competitiveness of key sectors that are stranded and locked in because there are barriers to their productivity. So you look at the private sector and you identify your potential sources of good growth, especially growth that is shared because of the sheer size and number of people who operate in those sectors. And you improve productivity by removing barriers. So it means that you have to innovatively think of how to provide the basic services that that businesses and people need in order to be competitive, in order to be productive. Then you'll also, so when you generate more productivity through the companies and through your people, what happens is that you expand your base of revenue that you get as government, right? Then you look at the expenditure side. As a matter of fact, the expenditure side is the first side you look at. You need to get your structure into a place of balance as much as possible. Do you remember that there was something called the cost of governance reform? It was completed, and what remained was for it to be implemented. What happened to it? What happened to it? Despite the very stark outcome of the cost of governance exercise, we showed that we were in trouble. We were operating with a very humongous bureaucracy, that had never been questioned. Everyone that came contributed on one agency or the other. I saw it when I was Minister of Education. Yeah. I met in the ministry 22 parastatals. And I said, what are we doing with 22 parastatals? And education is in a dismal state. My predecessors, everyone that came had contributed one parastatal. So ordinarily, I should contribute one parastatal. I went in the other direction.
You know how it works in government.
I went in the other direction. So instead of 22, I classified that we could work well with 11 parastatals. When I left government, they said, thank God.
Most ministers want personal empires, and there's territoriality.
We shouldn't do that. It's unfair to our people.
Even when you want to reform the bureaucracy, people will resist it.
No, but it's unfair to the poor. The poor.
I wish we had
one last
more
question.
Time on this,
one last question. About
ACPN.
ACPN. How strong do you think that party is in the face of PDP, APC? Because the race for 2019 has already been reduced to a two-horse race.
No, it's not a two-horse race. You just wait. We're not here to make a statement. We're here to win. Our party is the party of the citizens. The citizens are tired of getting the wrong end of the stick in governance. So it is a citizens' movement. That's what we're building. ACPN, the Allied Congress Party of Nigeria, is the party of hope. And that party actually was number 4 in the 2015 elections. It does have a national spread. It's not as octopus, as these APC, PDP, those ones are Siamese twins. They are of the same, the umbilical cord is unbroken. So we're not even, we're running against Atiku Buhari, Atiku. But in our own case, Oji, are you saying this as a matter of? No, are you ready to go to court with me?
I'm asking.
Okay, because there was no campaign.
You didn't campaign.
He is
for
in
Buhari.
Government. Did he see me campaigning for Buhari?
Okay.
What they decided was campaign for Buhari was that I was asking the then government to bring children that had been abducted. Well, so let's not conflate on issues. Okay. But I am saying to you, I've got to say this because people should please go to our ACPN handle and follow the party because it's a citizens movement. We need every Nigerian who is tired of this old failing Nigeria and who desire the new Nigeria of our dream to sign on to this movement. When they tell you that, structure, do you know who structure is? Structure is actually the Nigerian citizens who give of themselves to people who have failed them over and over again. change it, and you will see they are the ones without structure.
I want to return to one other question. I know you addressed it earlier.
Yes.
When you talked about Chibok girls, Dapchi girls, about regional cooperation on the issue of security, about intelligence gathering, about security sector reform. But in more specific terms, can you tell Nigerians who are watching this program what you will do in real terms to make their lives more secure?
To make their life more secure, I would make it dignity of the Nigerian life will be at the top. Everything will come percolate from there. That's the overarching goal, that the dignity of the Nigerian life would need to be back again at the top of the way that governance is conducted. And so whether there are policies or there are institutions or there are investments that are necessary to achieve that, they are going to be prioritized as the things that we do. And the other thing is that because we are running on this matter of Hope 2019, do you know that 3 to 4 million young people join the unemployment, join the labor market every year? Only 10% of them would find anything near enough to be called decent jobs. We are going to tackle the economy, hands-on, heads-on. And you know what? We're going to make tough choices. You can imagine clearly that I would not be fazed by what it would take. I would pay every political cost that I need to pay in order to make sure that the young people of this country, the women of this country, feel that they have a stake in Nigeria. We will no longer be a country where growth happens for certain people. All of us will grow because all of us are running.
Well, thank you very much.
Dr. Ezekwesili, it was such a pleasure to have you here. Can I just say, you have my vote?
Please tell your viewers all the
Is this a woman thing?
Yes.
I even know that Dr. Abati will vote for me.
Yes.
To pay for your sins.
Oh my God. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so
It's
much.
time now for a short break. When we come back, the Managing Director and Chief Executive of Cowry Asset Management Limited, Mr. Johnson Chukwu, will be here to discuss Nigeria's ballooning foreign debt and what it means for the country. Do stay with us.